there have been 3, maybe 4 times where I have seen something unfold on screen and it was so funny and so groundbreaking and so in its moment, aware of its moment culturally, that I thought, hey, this is going to be what all the jokes are for the next 10 years. It's going to be just like that. Because right now, this is the perfect formula for what we need and what we think is funny. And the last time I really felt that was when I saw my first ever episode of The British Office. Ricky Gervais, the tall, skinny guy whose eyeball falls out from Pirates of the Caribbean, Bilbo Baggins, a bunch of other really talented people. They work at a paper company and they work in cubicles and they prank each other a little bit, and it should be incredibly boring and mundane. But because all of the characters are just barely into that hyperbole range, the jokes work. The boss is boorish and overbearing, and he kind of drives all of the friction. And then you've got sort of a knowing character, a male version and a female version, who both feel like your point of view character. The documentarians, though they're invisible or one of the characters, the camera is a character. It's just a different way to tell a joke. And sure enough, the story was so compelling and it was so in the moment that it started to spawn, I wouldn't even say spin-offs, I would say duplicate stories, because they're all the same season. They're all season 1, and all of these is identical. They tell the same story. So of course you got the American Office that everybody knows with Michael Scott and Dwight Schrute and Jim and Pam and all of that business. But did you know that there is also a French-Canadian office and a French office and a German office and a Swedish office and a Finnish office and a Czech office and a Chilean office and an Israeli office, and I don't know how many more. And all of them are really doing the same thing. Why? Well, like I said, because this story is in the moment and it's really funny. Yeah, but people all over the world speak English. Why not just let them watch the British Office? Well, I think this is why. Because even though I got a lot of the jokes and a lot of the nuance in the British Office, I'm still not British, never worked in an office there. But if you took those same style of jokes and you just used things that an American from the Midwest would understand, it is going to slay. And along comes the American Office, and sure enough, I get all the jokes. I get everything. And, well, then you start thinking about it further. And you're like, well, I mean, even though you could put them all in English, you could put them all in some different languages too. And then those people would get the jokes all the better. This channel, it's not about The Office. It's about the Bible. I'm always talking about the Bible on the 10-minute Bible hour. So I know you're always looking for the segue, and get ready, because here it comes. It's a lot like the Bible. Segue. Because the question that might come up is, why do we have 4 accounts of Jesus instead of 1 account of Jesus? Why do we need 4 spin-offs? Why not have just one monolithic 21st century style, I spit like a fountain there, 21st century style biography with footnotes, and it covers everything and runs down all the facts? Why not have that? And I think I think one of the reasons is very similar to why there's so many versions of The Office. Because the message of Jesus was clearly designed and intended by the God who's behind it, or if you don't believe there's a God who's behind it, the people who are behind it, to go out to the whole world. And it did go out to the whole world. So what happens when the only account that's floating around of who Jesus was and what he did is entirely targeted at Jewish people? And what happens if you become interested in the whole Jesus thing, but you've never been off the Italian peninsula? You don't speak the language that the Hebrew people speak. You don't know Aramaic. And you've never even seen a photograph, because that's not really an option, of Judea or Galilee. How can you wrap your brain around all of these subtle little nuances? You can't picture the place. You can't picture the stuff. You don't have the details. And a book like Matthew assumes the Jewishness of its audience. Matthew's not making much of any effort to make this make sense to people outside of a Jewish religious cultural context. Well, if that's the case, I guess you need to write some other versions of the story that tell basically the same story, but that are targeted at different audiences so they can get that nuance and so they can wrap their brains around it. So again, if you believe that these are the words of life and the message that all of planet Earth needs to hear, it would make sense that you would go out and write 4 of these things, maybe more of these things in total. Well, it turns out to be 4, because there are basically 4 cultural groups that are hanging around that would need to be addressed. Well, 3, and then one that kind of covers the whole big thing, that being John. So In this video, and we're already way into it because I guess this is just how we're doing it today, I want to talk about why there are 4 Gospels instead of 1. One reason we've already covered is because there were a lot of different people groups in the very cosmopolitan world that was the first century Roman Empire. And, well, there are other reasons too, so we're going to get into that. But before we do, I need to remind you that after this video, seriously, if you haven't seen the British Office, you need to go make it happen. I'm Matt, this is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's talk about some more reasons there are 4 Gospels instead of 1. So again, the first reason we got 4 instead of 1 is because the audience was diverse, and like The Office, the message is culturally catered to a whole bunch of different people. But I think the second reason is like that, but a little more ideological in nature. Each of these Gospels advances a different theme that is one portion of a larger set of themes. You know what? There's symbolism that explains this. Hang on a second. I'm going to go grab something. Where I put that? Let's go. There we are. Right in, right there. And this guy is close enough. And it's like, whatever. So on the long and winding road of history, the gospel authors pick up symbols that are associated with them. And this is the best I can do, but Matthew is associated with the angel, and we lost Warren Worthington's footstand there. That's going to have to do. Mark is associated with a winged lion. Didn't put wings on this, but you get the idea. Luke is associated with the ox or the bull, and I'm going to squish his butt or he will not sit down. Bull moose, best I can do. And then John is associated with an eagle, falcon, close enough. You get the idea. So these 4 symbols are kind of emblematic of the fact that there are differences thematically amongst these Gospels. Matthew, written to Jewish people, emphasizes the kingship of Jesus, that Jesus is the son of David, king, line of kings, see what he's doing there, that Jesus is the new Moses, and that in Jesus, God is creating a new family of faith that is based around belief in Jesus, and that is the completion of the family of faith that was based around ethnic lines in the Old Testament. Mark depicts Jesus as the suffering servant of God who comes to do what has to be done to deal with the sins of the world and to be submissive to the will of God the Father. Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man, emphasis on his humanity, and emphasizes that Jesus is here for all. And if Luke doesn't emphasize that hard enough, it becomes very explicit in its sequel, written by the same guy, the book of Acts, that Jesus and the message of salvation is for everybody, including people you would figure this just would never, ever, ever work for. Finally, John is the oddball. It comes maybe a few decades even after the fact, at the very end of John's life, probably toward the end of the 1st century AD. And John, who was a young man when Jesus is around, is emphasizing the divinity of Jesus. He's emphasizing that Jesus is God in the flesh, and he bases his gospel around 7 I am statements, I am being the name of God as revealed in what we would call the Old Testament. So thematically, we're not doing the same thing here. Now, none of these themes are in conflict with each other. Jesus is king, but he's the king who suffers and voluntarily lays down his life. And despite his authority to defeat anyone who would want to do him any harm, he humbles himself even to the point of death on the cross. Why? To save all of humanity, so that everybody, even if you seem like somebody who would theoretically be too bad, or born with the wrong genitals, or born in the wrong place, or born at the wrong time, or speaking the wrong language, guess what? Jesus is for you, no matter how much it might seem culturally like he's not. He is. He was for you all along. And then finally, John comes along and says, and this Jesus, if it wasn't clear enough from these other 3 thematic accounts, is God in the flesh, Savior of all, the great I am. I almost feel bad even including this next one on the list because it's so obvious, but, in the interest of being thorough, here we go. The reason, or one of the reasons that there are 4 Gospels instead of 1 is that 4 different people wrote about it because they saw stuff or heard stuff and they wanted to. And as a result, you've got 4 different perspectives because they saw it or their sources saw it from a slightly different angle. Just like you would have whenever any big, gigantic, important thing happened and you interviewed several of the most enthusiastic witnesses. But I get how some of you are going to hear that and you're going to be like, yeah, but the problem isn't that there are 4 accounts. The problem is that the accounts don't line up perfectly. And you have actually got a pretty good point. There are moments of friction between 2 or more of these Gospels, and not just 1 or 2. There are several apparent moments of friction. And well, one of the reasons that that's going to be there is, again, because these are very different authors and they saw different stuff, and that's cool and to be expected. Another reason that I guess they're there and I'm not threatened by it is it does indicate that while there may have been some cross-pollination, as we've discussed, between these authors, they didn't sit down, or rather some after-the-fact organization didn't sit down and use their force and power to make them all line up, to get their stories straight so that we could create a religion out of thin air and then convince people to believe it and then take over the Roman Empire and wield unbelievable amounts of power forever. Some of that stuff did happen later, but the gospel accounts predate any church power processes by centuries. So that to me actually smacks of its authenticity, the fact that there's some friction, that is. But I know some of you rightly at this point are like, wait a minute, you're going to gloss over this. You're just going to skip the part where there's friction. That's the important part. No, I'm not going to gloss over it. What I'm going to do is take it extra double seriously because I'm troubled by them too. When I first started reading the Gospels, I remember I just got the story and the gist, and it was amazing and awesome. I want to do this. I want to be a Christian. And then as I got a little older and I read them more carefully, I started to notice a few of those things where I felt like, oh, maybe that doesn't perfectly line up. But I tried to make that go away because I wanted to lie to myself, because I wanted there to be a God and I wanted to feel better about dying, and I didn't want my parents to be wrong. But then later, when I quit feeling guilty about having questions about something as important as the Bible and faith, started looking more at those, and some of them quickly reconciled themselves, and some of them were really stinking hard. So, because I don't want to just blow this off, because I think it is a reasonable question, in the next Nuts and Bolts of the Bible video that I do, we're going to dig into tons of these passages where there are apparent conflicts between the Gospels. And we're going to try and kind of sort them out into the ones that are maybe blown out of proportion and ones that, honestly, that might be, frankly, pretty challenging. And I might not know exactly how to resolve it at this point. And I think we're going to have a blast. But again, all of this was just to say that one of the reasons you got 4 Gospels instead of 1 is because there were 4 credible accounts. These are going to come from a little different angle and a little different perspective. And as a result, the stories are going to look and feel a touch different. And that justifies, because of the extra detail and perspective, having 4 instead of 1. I think a third reason, and I didn't put much thought into what order I'm doing these in, but I think a third reason that we got 4 Gospels instead of 1 Gospel is that something unfolded chronologically that caused one Gospel author to address questions that people would naturally be asking after reading the Gospel of another Gospel author. So there are 2 theories about the order in which this unfolded. The most common theory for the last couple hundred years is that Mark came first, and that after Mark, you have Luke and Matthew, who drew on the material that Mark put out there and maybe drew on some other individual sources. And so Matthew and Luke look a lot like Mark. Mark is shorter. Matthew and Luke are the more elaborate version of the story. That is one theory. Could be. There are good reasons to think it. Another theory that I've been finding really interesting lately is that Matthew came first. There's a lot of support for this amongst the church fathers over the first 300, 400 almost years of Christianity, saying that Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic, the language of the Hebrews, first, and that in doing so, he was putting together a really comprehensive story of Jesus to the people who would have been most interested in hearing it in the first place. This theory would go that Matthew was a very, very, very early expression of the gospel. Some would argue even dating to as early as the 40s AD. I don't know. Most people say 50 to 70. I wasn't there, so I'm just telling you the theory. So the deal with Matthew then would be that he wrote this in Aramaic. Gradually, it makes its way into Greek and starts to make the rounds. But while that's going on, Luke and his buddy Paul are out sailing around the Mediterranean world, and everywhere they go, people become Christians. But again, you remember the theme of Luke. It's people who theoretically shouldn't become Christians. They're the wrong people. They're born the wrong way. They speak the wrong language. They got the wrong color hair and eyes, whatever it might be. But they're clearly becoming Christians. And according to the biblical text, again, understanding not everybody believes that the miraculous stuff is true, but I do. According to the biblical text, there's miraculous confirmation that these people are legitimately becoming Christians. So then they want to know, well, can we? And what's the deal with that? We want to understand Jesus, but we don't get the Matthew version. So then Luke's version starts to take shape, using some of the apostles and what he's seeing with Paul as a source. Then we all end up in Rome together. Matthew's off somewhere else now. And we all end up in Rome together, and Peter, Paul, Mark, Luke all hanging out. They compare notes. Mark is drawing on Matthew and Luke and Mark effectively would have gone out to the masses receiving the affirmation of Paul and Peter at the same time. And then way after the fact, you got a new theological question that arises. And the new theological question that arises out of these three existing gospels is, what do we do with this new version of Christianity that attempts to synthesize Greek thought with Jesus' thought? It ends up being called Gnosticism. And I know there are a lot of people who really like Gnosticism to this day, and it does not matter how I define it. You're going to be like, what? No, that's not what Gnosticism is. You're wrong. Gnosticism is slippery. It's a 2,000-year-old thing, and it moves along a lot, so I don't have time to get into all of the details there. But effectively, John comes along, and it's pretty clear that what he's trying to do is make it crystal clear, obvious to everybody. No, Jesus is not all man or all God at the expense of being human, all human at the expense of being God. He is definitely divinity. He is definitely God in the flesh, and he is definitely the savior of everything. And he is definitely now, with God doing what he's supposed to be doing in eternity as savior. So each of these then would be addressing a question that would have arisen because of the last gospel that came out. Well, you think about how this works. If you sit and, let's say, for example, you make YouTube videos, right? And you make one on a topic, and a bunch of people come out, and they're like, oh, thanks, it's nice and everything, but I have a question about this. And you're like, it was a 13-minute video. I don't know. I didn't have time to do that, but that's a really fair question. Okay, I'll make another one. So then you make a follow-up video, maybe, let's say, hypothetically. And then a bunch of other people are like, wait a minute. I liked what you said in the first one, but the second one, I don't know, I got some questions about that. And you're like, okay, yeah, that's fair. But I mean, it is an 11-minute video. I get it. I'll make another one. And then you make another one, and pretty soon you realize, like every time I make a video, it raises more questions because it's a complicated thing. So I get what that can be like, and I'm not exactly good at this stuff. I think it's remarkable that these gospels are all addressing different thematic questions, different theological questions, and they all are so cohesive together. But I also think it's remarkable that they're so cohesive together in that they all seem to be answering questions raised by the others. So we have 4 gospels instead of 1 because we're talking to different people. We have different witnesses seeing these things. We're advancing different themes, and the gospels weren't all written at once. A lot of time passed in between them, and as a result, different questions would emerge over that time, just as different cultural questions have emerged between the 1970s and now. So it did then. So chronologically, there's an evolution to each of them wanting to speak to what was floating around out there in the world at the time that they wrote their document. Like I said, probably a whole bunch more reasons that you get 4 instead of 1, but I think this is a beautiful strength of the New Testament and of Christian history. And I think part of the reason that the message of Jesus has gone all the way around the world and been so translatable to all different kinds of people is exactly because of this mentality. Jesus comes along, he's like, hey, this is meant for everybody. Now here's the one and only version of my story, so sign up for that, even if it doesn't make any sense to you. It actually seems kind of counter to the whole message of the New Testament and Jesus, that this is for everybody. The fact that there are 4 is a literary and visual reminder that this is for you, me, everybody, including the people that you think are weird, and you people that think I'm weird, it's for me too. This is a pretty awesome thing. Okay, landing the plane here because we've gone on for a long time. We're going to do more stuff about the Gospels, some of the questions about who wrote it, when they wrote it, how did this all go down, because the Gospels always seem to be one of the most controversial and debated parts of the Bible. So more nuts and bolts of the Bible on the Gospels coming up. Thank you to everybody who supports this channel at patreon.com/TMBH. And thank you to everybody who is checking out the new podcast. It's a daily podcast. You can get it anywhere you get the podcast. It's called, unsurprisingly, the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. We're going through the book of Matthew, and it's been pretty fun. So, last note, Literally everyone who is supporting this channel right now at either of the Patreon pages for this or for the podcast is going to get mailed this awesome TMBH enamel pin that I think completely rules. So just as a way of saying thank you to everybody. Okay, I think that's plenty. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Let's do this again soon.